Hey guys, it's your boy Evix, and today I want to be talking about the meta in Final Fantasy XIV. My knee-jerk one-line response that I want to outright say is obviously play what you want to play, it is a video game. But the answer is, for better or worse, a little bit more complicated than that. Meta in a nutshell means that you are picking the right job to complete content in Final Fantasy XIV. And unfortunately, if you don't pick this so-called meta, that you will not only have a harder time finding groups, but also potentially be treated really poorly in the ones that you do get in. A lot of this mentality stems from players coming from World of Warcraft where, yeah, if you were playing something like Feral Druid, you got dumped on by your group. You were probably being memed on probably every single raid, if I'm honest. Just speaking to so many people who've had that experience, that is probably the case. Or one of my favorites is, oh no, we expected a boomkin and not a feral druid. I am not wasting my key on this. Surprisingly enough, even I personally experienced this during their System Lands expansion when I went to play Beastmaster Hunter and Resto Druid. Beastmaster Druid at the time, which was nowhere considered near as powerful of a DPS as some of the other options, namely something like Fire Mage. And then Resto Druid was frankly not Holy Paladin and not Resto Shaman that were absolutely popping off at the time. I don't keep up with World of Warcraft though these days, so who is to say if that is still true, but when I was playing at the start of System Lands, it was absolutely true. But this is a Final Fantasy XIV meta video, not a World of Warcraft one, but it is important to keep that context in mind because that is really a commonly shared thread between the people that I talk to. So one thing that has been buzzing around like Amber Heard's lawyers trying their best to shut down an expert witness is Final Fantasy XIV's meta. What am I meant to play in order to not play an LOL Feral Druid or an LOL Beastmaster Hunter? This is where it gets complicated, like I said at the start of this video. I want to say just anything works, but that's not quite the full truth. There are things that fit in better in certain scenarios than others. Such as for me, it's hard for me even to have some classes that I don't just recommend for casual content that I genuinely believe would make your experience in casual content a bit better. Take for instance the Agalia Alliance raid, where during its initial launch you had many newer players tank the floor at a wild rate, let the bodies hit the floor. Damn, I just aged myself again. But obviously the Agalia raid has largely been cleaned up now that the content has been out for a while, but even here, any job with a revive instantly has a huge perk above the rest in my mind. Red Mage and Summoner can and have saved runs that were going poorly. Factually, having extra revives in a party at hand, especially in extreme trials or savage content, is a huge perk. Expert roulette, probably not such a big deal. You can just wipe and keep going. But there is no denying that sometimes healers make mistakes. Heck, even I play a healer, so you know there is at least one foolish healer out there. Yeah, I'll say it. So having a DPS swoop in, revive a healer to allow them to limit break and potentially save a run is a pretty big deal. Such a big deal that when I personally have been pushed into being asked what DPS would I play personally above all the rest, having that revive pushes me strongly in favor of the jobs that offer that. That is a very big perk to me. It's like having air conditioning in a car. It's like, do I need it objectively all the time? No, I obviously don't. But you know what? Having it there's nice. Take Endsinger for instance, still in Party Finder has a comical amount of deaths, and that's not me throwing shade. That is, the earth mechanics are very big and very easy to get hit by. But those deaths, if those deaths are healer deaths, then no one can revive and that run is over. Better wall. And that obviously sucks when you're like 25% to like clearing it and you just want your totems. You're like, I just want my Lynx mount, I almost said doggo. I just want my doggo and to leave. That sucks. Red Mage just simply has a nauseating amount of revives, which allows a Red Mage player to essentially hard carry until their MP hits 0, and at that point, oh my lord, I've hit that a few times myself and that's scary. But my argument here is, and I'd probably argue quite successfully for most Savage raid progression groups, makes Red Mage a very meta pick for progression raiding. But that's an oversimplification. Summoner only has one Swift Cast Revive, which is often all you can afford to have. I'm not saying all you need, but all you can afford to have. If you, in many forms of content, die more than 3 times across the party, that you could cover, obviously you have 2 from each of the healers, 1 from each of the healers, adding up to 2, then you have the extra 3rd from the summoner, and then somehow you have a 4th death. now you're in genuine trouble of not beating an enrage check. Especially earlier on the tier, that can spell complete disaster and not meeting the enrage check. Like P4S at the start was very, very hard enrage check. Even now, even with gear, if you get enough deaths, like if you're past 5 deaths, I don't know if you're going to beat that enrage check, especially because the weakness debuff is so strong. I mean, damage down debuff. Although this still means in most progression environments, Black Mage is still a little out of luck, if I'm honest. But it is how they say a good Black Mage does wonders. And that is a statement that I truly do believe myself, having a Black Mage in my group. But few candid raiders would say, yeah, that they actively select for Black Mage over Red Mage during prog. Very, very few. Usually the ones with Black Mage one-trick friends, which obviously is not mine. They play many, many classes. They have been progging on Astra. That's not the case, just to be super clear on that. But in general, people will prefer a Red Mage for their group over a Black Mage during prog. But enough about revives. This is a meta video, and holy shoot, it is not a revive video. P3S introduced a brand new form of meta, where the Astrologian job became the de facto pure healer because of the Macrocosmos ability that essentially nullified the hardest mechanic of that fight: Life's Agonies. This pushed the White Mage to suddenly become less desirable, where White Mage frankly already had a significant problem with MP concerns for many players that was later essentially deleted with the Lily cooldown being lowered. It was a very significant buff, to say the least. Now, this did result in some groups pushing for P3S for an Aster to be in their party. Yeah, it absolutely did. But with great irony, my group was me on Scholar Sage and then Boyfriend on White Mage. I never had the knowledge or care to even acquire the knowledge of how an ass did it, because we simply learned how to properly mitigate, heal, and shield that mechanic. Now, I'm not giving myself a golden star of weird internet points that I sadly cannot cash in for even a barbecue hamburger. I wish that I could. But I'm saying that the supposedly mandatory and meta ass thing was far from necessary, and that the mechanic was a clown world joke after a few pulls. But there were pockets of the community, especially particular toxic self-aggrandizing pockets, that boldly proclaimed Ast was so significantly better than White Mage in every single aspect that everyone playing a White Mage was essentially throwing the game, genuinely trolling, and should be really pressured to swap to Astrology. And there was this very weird wave of thought that you should try and pressure the White Mages to swap to Astro. I kid you not, even my boyfriend suffered from this stupid take, and thankfully those members are no longer with us. But some PF groups did select against White Mage actively because of this, but in a static environment with players who did have a brain, it was more or less a breeze in the wind to us. Actually, it was less than a breeze in the wind to us. Or what about Dark Knight? And now listen, I'm not saying that Dark Knight didn't need some quality of life improvements, especially with Living Dead and Dark Knight blood weapon skill. Living Dead is currently one of my favorite tank immunity skills because I literally get to ignore the tank. Wonderful, that works really great for me. It's a complete brain swap though from the previous benediction for Dark Knight thing, but like I love it. Before these buffs, I had healed in Savage double Dark Knight composition successfully, and yes, that includes P3S, many clears of it. We simply did, for the ease of healing, a strategy called Inumaru, rather than the standard Meta or absolutely degenerate Elmo strategy, which, goodness gracious, why do people still do Elmo strat? Inumaru and Mita both barely require neurons to rub against one another, if I'm honest. I run and grab the left tornado and aim it out. But I digress. Meta in this situation just wasn't worth the paper that it was written on. It just was not worth the paper it was written on. Now, one last case that I would like to look at is that there is actually a valid meta consideration for if you are in Party Finder where it's a weak group. Obviously, revive consideration should be made here depending on the group, obviously, but if you already have the revives covered, this is very, very relevant. Obviously, Machinist, Samurai, Black Mage are all DPS that do not sacrifice their own personal DPS to buff the party, meaning that if you're actually a genuinely excellent player, which I would still not call myself, to be honest, I just press buttons and things happen, guys, but if you are a genuinely excellent player and in a weaker group like I have been in the past that are still struggling to bait basic enrage timers, then frankly, Machinist, Samurai, Black Mage, and the so-called selfish DPS category are actually the biggest benefit to your team's progression that exists in this game. 99th percentile DPS Samurai will do far more damage and contribute far more to successful enrage clear than some player on that exact same player on Dragoon throwing away the damage on Grey parsing teammates. That sounds toxic AF, but if the goal is to beat the enrage timer, it's pretty simple logic and facts, actually. Remember, everyone's goal is to clear the fight, be done with it, and just move on to the next fight and get whatever books, whatever loot they want, or the mount. Too many people make this like a measuring contest, and I'm like, y'all, can we just clear? I'm a basic bitch. Yeah, that really does it for this video. I am wrapping it up here because I think that these examples fairly show that meta in 14 is very varied. There are situations where something can be a better pick and better leveraged in a situation, but a blanket statement meta is kind of crazy. It's just like white mage was obviously functioning before. Is it obviously better with buffs? Oh yeah, but white mage is a godsend now. And Dark Knight's doing amazing, but never at any point were they unclearable in Savage content. Like, we're not talking about like, oh, they can do like an expert roulette. Like, we were doing Savage with double Dark Knight, and I was healing Life's Agonies with a white mage myself personally. Meta, for better or worse, has sometimes that's important, but on other times, it's not worth the paper it's written on. I've said that 3 times.